The silence in the grand ballroom was a physical weight. Every eye was on Julian Croft as he stood alone in the spotlight, the golden trophy for Innovator of the Year gleaming on the podium beside him. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the final waltz, the one he, the undisputed king of this glittering universe, would lead. Across the floor, Isabella and her court preened, their laughter like the clinking of sharp, tiny bells. Isabella, a vision in diamond white, tilted her chin with the serene confidence of a queen who knows her crown is assured. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her dress. Her eyes locked on Julian, waiting. From the shadows near the service exit, Clara felt a familiar cold knot of shame tighten in her stomach. Invisible, that was her shield. In her plain gray dress, the only formal thing she owned, and thick glasses, she was just part of the background. A ghost, haunting the edges of other people's perfect lives. She clutched the tray of empty champagne flutes, a prop to justify her existence in this space. But Julian's gaze swept right over Isabella. It moved past the sea of silk and jewels, past the expectant smiles and hungry eyes. The silence in the room began to curdle, shifting from anticipation to confusion. His eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, searched the fringes of the crowd, and then they stopped. On her! Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. No, not me. He started walking. Not towards the throne, but towards the shadows. The crowd parted for him, a wave of whispers and stifled gasps rippling in his wake. He was coming closer. Clara's first instinct was to flee, to drop the tray and run into the kitchen, into the night, anywhere but here. This had to be a joke. A cruel, elaborate prank, orchestrated to finally break her completely. The ultimate humiliation, pain, the familiar searing pain of being the punchline was already rising in her throat. He stopped directly in front of her. He was taller than she'd imagined, and the warmth radiating from him was a stark contrast to the icy dread flooding her veins. The entire world went quiet. There was only the scent of his cologne and the terrifying, impossible focus of his gaze. He gently took the heavy tray from her trembling hands and set it on a nearby table. Then, as 1,000 pairs of eyes burned into her, he extended his hand. "Clara," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through her panic. "Forgive me for being late. I've been waiting all night to ask you. Do you remember the promise I made you 3 months ago?" 3 months earlier, Chapter 1. The Mirror of Cruelty. Hope was a tiny, trembling bird in Clara's chest. It fluttered nervously against her ribs every time the heavy wooden door of the restaurant La Belle Époque swung open. Clara smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her simple navy blue dress. It was the most elegant piece in her closet, yet she felt like a gray moth that had wandered into a jewelry store amidst all the velvet and crystal. Her gaze was fixed on the entrance, her hand unconsciously moving to her left cheek. An instinctive gesture. There, hidden under a carefully arranged veil of hair, lay the scar. A pale, silver crescent moon stretching from her cheekbone to her jaw. A silent witness to a long-ago accident. But for Clara, it was a daily brand, the mirror of cruelty that screamed her own sentence into her face every morning. But tonight was supposed to be different. Marcus had invited her. The Marcus, with his carefree laugh that filled the university corridors and eyes as blue as a summer sky. He, who was surrounded by the most beautiful girls, had spoken to her. He had said he liked her quiet nature. He had said her eyes behind the glasses held something mysterious. Every word had been like a drop of balm on her wounded soul. When he finally entered, the room seemed to hold its breath for a moment. He was like a promise of a life she only knew from movies, tall, confident, his smile radiant and effortless. He saw her, waved, and walked toward her table with a spring in his step. The little bird in her chest did a wild somersault. He really came. "For me, Clara, sorry, did I keep you waiting?" he said, his voice even warmer than in her memory. "No, not at all. I just got here," she lied, feeling the blush rise in her face. The beginning of the evening was a blurry, beautiful dream. He told jokes and she laughed, a real, liberated laugh that surprised even her. He asked about her literature studies, and for the first time, she spoke passionately about poetry without feeling stupid. He listened, or seemed to, and the bird in her chest began to sing softly. She almost forgot the scar, forgot she was Grey Clara. For a fleeting moment, she was just a woman on a date with a man who made her smile. The turning point came unannounced. Loud laughter from a nearby table tore her from her trance. Sitting there were 4 of Marcus's friends, all cut from the same mold of arrogant beauty. They raised their glasses in their direction, wide, knowing grins on their faces. Clara felt a cold sting. Coincidence? Marcus's demeanor changed instantly. The warmth in his eyes extinguished, replaced by a cool, calculating glint. He leaned across the table, his smile now a mask. "You know, Clara," he began with a new, theatrical gentleness, "there is something—" His hand rose, slowly, as if in slow motion. Clara froze. "Please don't." Her heart hammered a painful, panicked rhythm. "Please, please, don't." His fingers, which had felt so warm just moments ago, were now ice cold on her skin. With a quick, almost casual movement, he brushed the hair away from her face. A gesture that could have been tender, but was cruel in its intent. The scar, her constant silent companion, lay exposed under the harsh light of the chandelier. Naked. Vulnerable. Marcus pulled his hand back as if he had touched something impure. He leaned back in his chair, looked at his friends, and then shouted loudly, so loudly that several heads turned toward them. "How can someone walk around like that? That is absolutely disgusting." Chapter 2. The Prince's Choice. The word disgusting was not a blow. It was worse. It was acid, eating through her skin, through her bones, straight to the core of her being. Time froze. The restaurant fell silent for a fraction of a second, an infinite void, before the laughter of his friends exploded like a spray of dirty fireworks. It was a vicious, unrestrained cackle that echoed off the elegant walls and rained back down on her. Other diners stared, some with pity, most with a mixture of shock and prim discomfort. Every single pair of eyes was a nail, fixing her to a pillory of public shame. Her face was on fire, but it was not the blush of shyness. It was the all-consuming furnace of humiliation, of shame. The pain was not just in her heart. It was physical. It constricted her throat, turning the air in her lungs to ice. She looked at Marcus's face. He wasn't laughing. He was smirking, a triumphant, ugly little grin. He had won. The bet, the dare, whatever it had been. Clara stood up, her movement stiff, clumsy. Her trembling hands fumbled for her handbag. She didn't look at anyone anymore. She saw only the floor, the faces of the other guests becoming blurred stains in her peripheral vision. The path to the door was the longest of her life, a gauntlet run through a sea of staring eyes and whispered judgments. Outside, the cold November air hit her like a physical shock after the restaurant's overheated atmosphere. She stumbled a few steps, leaning against a rough brick wall, and gasped for breath. Only then, in the darkness and the anonymity of the street, did the tears break free. Hot, salty, and bitter. She wasn't crying for Marcus. She was crying for the foolish, naive hope he had kindled inside her. She was crying for the small, trembling bird in her chest. It was no longer singing. It lay still and dead on the floor of its cage. Her shoulders shook with silent, body-racking sobs. She was a fool, a stupid, ugly fool who had dared to believe, for one fleeting evening, that someone could look at her, at the jagged white line that bisected her cheek, and see anything else. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth to stifle the sound. A wounded animal hiding in the shadows. "Miss?" The voice cut through her grief, like a beam of clean light through smoke. It was deep, calm, and possessed a quiet authority that had nothing to do with arrogance. It was not Marcus. It was not one of his friends. She flinched, pulling herself tighter against the wall, trying to become invisible. "Please," she whispered to the empty street, "just leave me alone." "I have no intention of leaving you alone." Footsteps approached, measured and unhurried. A man stopped a few feet away from her. In the dim glow of the street lamp, she could see he was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit. It was Julian, the owner. She had seen him once before, moving through the dining room with an air of effortless command. He was impossibly handsome, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold a profound stillness. She expected him to ask her to move along, a piece of unsightly refuse cluttering the entrance to his fine establishment. Instead, he simply stood there, his gaze not on her scar, but on her eyes. What he did, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, intense timbre, was unforgivable. Before she could form a reply, the restaurant door burst open. Marcus and his friends spilled out onto the pavement, still high on their cruel victory, laughing loudly. Marcus saw Julian holding the door and swaggered toward him. "Great place you've got here, mate. A bit of a shame about some of the clientele, though." He winked, a sly, nasty gesture meant for Clara. "Some things just ruin the appetite." Julian did not move. The air around him seemed to grow colder, heavier. "Did you enjoy your performance?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Marcus's smirk faltered slightly. "It was just a bit of fun. She needs to learn not to take herself so seriously." Julian took one step forward, and the sheer force of his presence made Marcus and his friends fall silent. The stillness of his anger was far more terrifying than any shout. "True ugliness," Julian said, his voice like chipping ice, each word a perfectly formed shard, "is a trait of character, not a scar on the skin." He paused, letting the words hang in the frigid air. "You have contaminated my restaurant with it for the last time. You are banned. All of you. Leave. Now." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Two large men in black suits materialized from the doorway, their expressions impassive. The arrogant group, suddenly stripped of their power, looked from Julian's glacial face to the imposing security staff. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by a sullen, humiliated flush. Without another word, they were firmly and very publicly escorted down the street. The entire exchange had taken less than a minute. The street was quiet again. Julian turned back to Clara. The ice in his eyes had melted, replaced by a look of such profound warmth and respect that it stole her breath. She was still pressed against the wall, her tears drying on her cold skin. He closed the distance between them and gently, as if handling something infinitely precious, he took her hand. His touch was warm and firm. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was an act of recognition. "A woman like you," he said, his voice now a low, gentle murmur that was for her alone, "deserves to be treated like a queen. Will you allow me to restart your evening?" He held her gaze, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. The fire of her shame transformed into a different kind of energy, a small, flickering ember of warmth deep within her chest. "I can't," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Everyone? They laughed." "Let them look," Julian said, his grip on her hand reassuringly steady. "Because if you walk back in there with me, no one will be laughing. They will see what I see." He led her back toward the entrance. She hesitated, terrified, but his confidence was a lifeline she couldn't help but grab. As they crossed the threshold back into the restaurant, the hushed whispers ceased instantly. Every head turned. But the stares were different now. The pity was gone, replaced by shock, by curiosity, and by an undeniable awe as the owner of the establishment escorted her personally. He walked past the smaller tables and led her directly to the best table in the entire room, the secluded corner booth with a panoramic view of the glittering city lights, the table that was always reserved for VIPs. He pulled out her chair for her. As she sank into the plush velvet, the gazes of the other diners felt less like nails and more like a spotlight. And for the first time in her life, standing in that light, she did not feel ugly. She felt seen. "My name is Julian," he said, sitting across from her, ignoring the staff who rushed to bring the finest champagne. "And I would very much like to know the story behind those beautiful, sad eyes." Chapter 3. The Promise. 3 months later, Clara stood in the ballroom, the memory of that night at the restaurant still vivid in her mind. Julian had kept his word. He hadn't just bought her dinner. He had become her friend, her confidant, and eventually the man who healed the bird in her chest. Back in the present, the music swelled. A waltz. Julian stood before her in the ballroom, his hand extended, just as it had been that night on the street. "You promised," she whispered, a smile touching her lips, tears of happiness pricking her eyes. "You said you'd take me to the ball." "And I intend to dance with the most beautiful woman in the room," Julian replied, loud enough for Isabella and her stunned court to hear. He swept her onto the dance floor. As they spun, Clara caught a glimpse of Isabella's face. Twisted in jealousy and shock, she saw Marcus, working as a waiter in the corner holding a tray, his mouth hanging open as he watched the girl he had called disgusting, dancing in the arms of the city's most eligible billionaire. Clara threw her head back and laughed, the sound pure and joyous. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was the queen.
Dear viewers, thank you for being here. Stay tuned to the channel for tons of exciting videos. Every day, we upload fresh stories packed with thrills and surprises. Don't miss out. Comment, share, subscribe, and hit that like button.